Train the muscles, not the joints.
Welcome back to Natural Bodybuilding Mountain. And today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about something that was said in the comments, which was a really smart comment, and it's something that I've said a few times, so it must be smart, right? But this guy said that there's no one way to perform an exercise. There are a number of different ways to do so, depending on what your goals and aspirations are. So what I've been trying to do on this channel is to take the ego out of this obsession around doing an exercise the one way that's dictated by some supposed expert. But you got to remember that all exercises are made up. Every single one of them. They're all made up by somebody that's built a certain way, that found out the ideal range of motion or technique for them. And then they said everybody else in the world should do it the exact same way. You know, they create the paradigm of perfection, which is not necessarily applicable to everybody. You know, a standard example is I squatted wrong my whole life, but I got massive legs from it. And even now, it's like cringy to even watch me squat because I'm only doing about 90 degrees at the knee, and I do low bar squats in order to take the stress off my knees, and I put all the stress on my hamstrings, my ass, and I get a wicked quadricep burn even though my knees aren't traveling far over my toes and I'm not sitting upright in the squat position. I'm bent over quite a bit. I know this looks stupid, but sometimes what looks stupid is actually going to give you the best results. Oh, just made that one. Oh shit. You got to go with that. You know what I mean? Like if something is injuring you, it cannot be the right thing. And that's what I've talked about a number of different times. In my opinion, and I've seen many guys injure themselves with deadlifts, I barely ever saw any great physiques be attributed because the guys were deadlifting from the floor. And Thor agrees with me. So there are some times where I've given you certain rules around certain exercises and said this is the way you should, for the most part, do it, and then from there you can cater the technique accordingly. And one of those exercises is the skull crusher. Now, what I'm going to say about the skull crusher is a lot of times when you see me do skull crushers, I bring my elbows more above my nose and then bend the arms, so that way I'm stretching the long head of the tricep. That's one very effective way to do it. But of course, there's a little bit of internal rotator cuff muscles, or you could say the teres major as well, in here that basically gets activated because there's a little bit of armpit involved, you could say, right? There's a little bit, just even isometrically. So one thing that I've been doing lately is I've been doing a more aggressive skull crusher, which I adamantly have told you not to do under certain conditions, and I will outline them right now, okay? So when I'm doing a more aggressive skull crusher and bringing the dumbbells down more towards my face, of course to the side, right? You don't want to smash yourself in the nose when you hit failure, right? But to the sides of my head, right? And when I'm coming up and down, I actually am getting a great tricep pump. But one thing I do is I limit the range of motion so I'm not jamming the elbows at the bottom. That's where I find there's more risk versus reward, and it doesn't necessarily give you any extra results. And that would be the major mistake people make when they bring the elbows down and they bring the dumbbells right close to their head, so they have a more aggressive tricep extension angle. What happens is sometimes they try to do a little bit too much so that the pressure in the joint is extreme. So what you want to do is have most of the stress in the muscle belly and stop just short of where you're getting extreme pressure in the elbow joint, and you'll find that you'll get the best of both worlds. You'll get an aggressive burn and pump in the tricep without the added inflammation in the elbows. You always see these guys on Instagram and YouTube running around with elbow wraps and stuff. You shouldn't need elbow wraps to train. If you need elbow wraps to train, there's a good chance that you've messed your elbows up somehow by something that you're doing. And being too aggressive and using too much tension at the bottom range of the motion could be a legitimate cause, right? A legitimate cause of that injury or inflammation. Now, if you want to go extreme in the range of motion, be all aggressive at the angles, understand another thing. You can do so, but remember, it is tension specific. So if you start to use extreme amounts of range of motion, use extreme amounts of light weight, all right? So if you're using super, super lightweight, it could be a rehabilitative sort of way of doing something. But if you're using too heavy, you're going to flare up the joint, right? So there's a different threshold of intensity that's needed. And I think people overestimate that threshold in a lot of cases when they're using extreme ranges of motion. So there can be benefits to both worlds, right? There's benefits to both worlds. It's a matter of experimentation to find out what percentage applies to you. But the one thing that I've talked about a lot on this channel is that there's an over obsession with extreme ranges of motion along with massive amounts of weight, which has caused most people to hit walls in their training, not only because they're not necessarily hitting the muscles they want to hit properly, because they're not keeping the tension on there, they're just bouncing off the joints, but also they're getting injured in a lot of cases where they can no longer continue training with those exercises. So these are things to take into account as you're training. You know, there's lots of different exercises you can do with extreme ranges of motion if you're going to use lighter weight. So another thing I talked about is dead hangs. Some people say, oh, dead hangs are great. I'm saying dead hangs are not great, and I made a video about this, so make sure you check it out, dead hangs. But you could do a dead hang in a very safe way if you use the right amount of tension. Now, if you're a heavier dude, right, say you're 250 and you do a dead hang, it's gonna be a lot harder on your shoulder capsule than say somebody that weighs 140 pounds, right? The other thing is, if you wish to rehabilitate a shoulder doing that, I would recommend using the lat pull down and using a lighter weight and doing something where you can stretch up without it being so much pressure in the joint that you're causing all sorts of inflammation. So remember, everything that you do is also intensity dependent, right? And if you're using too high of an intensity, then the range of motion has to be really strategically chosen, because if you do too much, then there can be some issues that pop up. But again, it's always about the individual. Some guys can do certain things, they never snap. I know a guy that actually was one of the steroid dudes from a gym that I used to train at, and then he became a drug addict, and he still can bend over row 4 plates for reps. You know what I'm saying? So, you know, some people, they seem to have these genetics where they can just get away with anything and there's no problem. So it's one of those things, right? Where I guess I'm just too much of a wimp, and that's probably why I had to refine the way I do things, even if they look stupid. Mountain. So if you like this kind of content, make sure you check out the podcast on Patreon. The link is in the description. Thanks a lot to the Patreon supporters, and take care for now. Mountain. Need a little. This guy's skiing down that. See? Skiing. Still skiing. Natural land.